The sound started at exactly 2:13 a.m. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint rustling, like someone dragging their hand across the outside of the tent. But it was enough to make me freeze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely audible. No one answered. We were deep in Black Hollow Forest, miles from the nearest town. It was supposed to be an easy weekend camping trip, just me, Chris, Sarah, and Jake. We'd been best friends since middle school, and the plan was simple: spend 2 nights out here, grill some food, tell ghost stories, and pretend to rough it in the wilderness. It didn't feel rough at all during the day. The sun streamed through the trees, the forest floor was alive with small animals and bird calls, and we'd set up camp in a clearing not far from a creek. But at night, it was a different story. The forest seemed to change after dark. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. The birds went silent, and the sound of the creek felt distant, like it was coming from another world. We were all in our tents by midnight, joking and laughing as the fire burned down to embers. But by the time that rustling started, all the laughter was gone. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't just the wind. Something, or someone, was moving outside. "Jake," I whispered again, my voice shaking. "Wake up." Jake groaned from his sleeping bag. "What?" "There's something out there," I said. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Probably a raccoon. Go back to sleep." But then the sound changed. It wasn't just rustling anymore. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling our tents. Jake's eyes widened as he heard it, too. "Chris," he called, his voice low. "Sarah." "I'm awake," Chris said from his tent. "What the hell is that?" "Not funny," Sarah snapped, clearly trying to mask the fear in her voice. "No one's joking," I said. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, holding our breath as the footsteps continued to circle. They'd stop for a moment, then start again, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted us to know they were there. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The silence was worse. Jake unzipped the tent slightly, just enough to peek outside with his flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the clearing. "There's nothing," he said after a moment. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, though his voice wasn't as confident as I wanted it to be. "No tracks, no movement. It's just us." "Maybe it was an animal," Sarah offered. "A deer or something." Chris snorted. "A deer doesn't circle your tent like that." "We're fine," Jake said firmly. "Let's just get some sleep." Eventually, we all managed to lie back down, but I don't think any of us really slept. I lay there for hours, listening to every crack of a branch, every gust of wind. By morning, the footsteps almost felt like a bad dream. Almost. We spent the next day hiking, trying to shake off the weirdness of the night before. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, tall, ancient trees stretched high above us, their branches forming a canopy that let in dappled sunlight. But even in the daylight, something felt off. The birds were quieter than they'd been the day before. The forest felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on us. By the time we made it back to the clearing, the sun was starting to set. Chris went to collect firewood, Jake and I started unpacking the food, and Sarah wandered off toward the creek to wash her hands. She came back pale, her hands shaking. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Someone was out there," she said, her voice trembling. Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" "I saw footprints," she said. "In the mud by the creek. Big ones. Like boots." "So?" Chris said, dropping an armful of firewood. "Maybe a hiker passed through." She shook her head. "They weren't there yesterday. And they're fresh. Whoever made them was out there today. We all went to check." Sure enough, there were footprints, large, deep, and deliberate, leading from the edge of the creek back toward the forest. But they didn't make sense. There was only one set. No tracks leading to the creek. Only a way. I don't like this, Sarah said, hugging herself. It's fine, Jake said, though he didn't sound convincing. We're not the only people out here. Someone probably passed by this morning. Chris nodded. Let's just eat and get a fire going. It's creepy at night without one. We didn't argue. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows returned, and the forest grew deathly quiet. We ate in near silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Then Chris broke the silence. Do you guys smell that? He asked. Smell what? I asked. He wrinkled his nose. It's like metal. Now that he'd said it, I smelled it, too, a sharp, metallic tang in the air, like rust or blood. It's probably just the fire, Jake said, poking at the flames. But Sarah shook her head. No. It's stronger than that. The smell grew worse as the night went on, clinging to the air like an invisible fog. It wasn't until I got up to grab more water from my bag that I noticed something strange. The firelight was reflecting off something on the ground. When I looked closer, I froze. It was a knife. A long, rusted blade lying just at the edge of the clearing. I picked it up carefully, holding it up to the light. Guys, I said, my voice shaking. Look at this. They all turned to look. What the hell? Jake said, getting up to inspect it. Where did you find that? Right here, I said, pointing to the ground. Chris frowned. That wasn't there earlier. Sarah took a step back. I don't like this. What if someone left it here? We all stared at the knife in uneasy silence. And then, somewhere deep in the forest, we heard a scream. It wasn't human. It was high-pitched, distorted, and echoed through the trees like something out of a nightmare. We froze, staring at each other, too terrified to move. Then it came again, closer this time. Something was out there. And it was coming for us. The scream echoed through the forest, chilling and wrong. None of us moved. The fire crackled weakly, but its warmth felt a million miles away. Sarah clutched her knees to her chest, her face pale in the flickering light. Did you hear that? She whispered. We all nodded. There was no point pretending we hadn't. It's an animal, Chris said finally, his voice thin. Like a coyote or something. They make weird sounds sometimes. That wasn't a coyote, Sarah shot back, her voice trembling. Jake stood up, gripping the knife I'd found earlier. Whatever it is, it's not getting any closer. Let's keep the fire going and stay alert. It sounded like a plan, but it didn't feel like one. I sat with my back to the fire, staring into the dark forest. The trees seemed impossibly tall now, their branches curling into jagged shapes against the night sky. Every now and then, I thought I saw something move, just a flicker of motion between the trunks. Do you see that? I whispered to Jake. See what? I pointed toward the edge of the clearing. Right there. Something moved. He squinted, holding the knife tighter. I don't see anything. But I did. For the next hour, the forest felt alive. The metallic smell hung in the air, stronger than before, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set us on edge. At one point, Chris stood up suddenly. What is it? I asked. Nothing, he said quickly, sitting back down. But his eyes told a different story. He'd seen something. Eventually, the fire began to die down. Jake and I got up to grab more wood from the pile Chris had collected earlier. Stay close, Jake muttered as we moved to the edge of the clearing. The woods felt darker here, the light from the fire barely reaching us. As we picked up a few logs, I glanced over my shoulder and froze. There was something standing between the trees. It was tall, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out any details, just a shadow, impossibly still, watching us. "Jake," I whispered. "What?" "Look," I said, nodding toward the figure. Jake turned, and the shadow moved. It didn't run or lunge, it just slipped between the trees, disappearing into the darkness like it had never been there. We sprinted back to the fire, dropping the wood in front of Chris and Sarah. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "There's someone out there," Jake said, breathless. "What do you mean, someone?" Chris asked. "Not an animal," I said. "A person. We saw them." Chris grabbed a branch from the fire, the flames licking at the tip. "You're sure?" "We're sure," Jake said firmly. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The air felt heavy, like the forest itself was pressing in on us. And then, from somewhere in the distance, we heard it again. The scream. This time, it was closer. "Get the fire bigger," Chris said, tossing more wood onto the flames. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Animals don't like fire," he said. Jake nodded. "And if it's not an animal?" Chris didn't answer. We sat in silence, huddled close to the fire, as the night dragged on. At some point, Sarah fell asleep, her head resting on her knees. Chris kept poking at the fire, muttering under his breath, and Jake stared into the woods, gripping the knife like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. I didn't sleep. At around 4 a.m., the fire was low again, the embers glowing faintly in the darkness. I was staring into the flames when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but it was there. At first, I thought it was the wind. But then it came again, closer this time. My name. I shot up, my heart racing. "Did you hear that?" Jake frowned. "Hear what?" "Someone said my name," I said, looking around frantically. Chris stood up, holding the burning branch. "Where?" "I don't know," I said. It was faint. Like a whisper. Before anyone could respond, the firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. And then, we heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching across the forest floor, circling just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Who's there?" Chris shouted, holding up the branch. The footsteps stopped. We all stood frozen, listening as the silence stretched on. And then, from the direction of the tents, came the sound of a zipper. Jake was the first to move, sprinting toward the tents with the knife in hand. I followed close behind, my heart pounding. When we reached the tents, we found Sarah's unzipped, the flap swinging slightly in the breeze. But Sarah wasn't inside. She was gone. We found Sarah sitting just beyond the edge of the clearing. Her back was to us, her shoulders stiff as she stared at the ground. The faint light from the fire barely reached her, casting long, eerie shadows across her figure. "Sarah?" I called, my voice shaking. She didn't turn around. Jake stepped forward cautiously, the knife still in his hand. "What are you doing out here?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, in a voice that didn't sound like hers, she said, "It was calling me." My stomach dropped. "What was calling you?" Chris asked, stepping closer. Sarah slowly turned her head, her face pale and expressionless. "I don't know." Jake knelt beside her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "You scared the hell out of us," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Let's get back to the fire." She nodded slowly, allowing him to help her up. But as she stood, I noticed something on the ground where she'd been sitting. A circle. It was drawn into the dirt with long, jagged lines, like someone had scraped it out with their fingernails. In the center were strange symbols, crude, angular shapes that looked like they didn't belong here. "What the hell is that?" Chris muttered, leaning in to get a closer look. "I didn't make it," Sarah said quickly, her voice trembling. Jake shone his flashlight over the circle. The dirt around the edges looked freshly disturbed, the marks sharp and deliberate. "It was already here," Sarah said. "When I got here, it was just there." "Let's go," Jake said firmly, ushering her back toward the fire. Chris lingered, staring at the circle for a moment longer. "Chris," I said. "Come on." He hesitated, then turned and followed us back to the clearing. The fire was nearly out by the time we sat down again, its warmth fading into the cool night air. Sarah wrapped herself in a blanket, her hands still shaking. "What do you mean it was calling you?" I asked her quietly. She shook her head. "I don't know. I was asleep, and then I wasn't. I had this feeling, like I had to go out there. Like something was waiting for me." "That's not normal," Chris said, poking at the fire with a stick. "None of this is normal." "Did you see anything?" Jake asked her. "No," she said, though her voice wavered. "Just the circle." We all sat in silence for a while, the weight of the night pressing down on us. Then I checked my watch. It was 4:15 a.m. "What time did you leave the tent?" I asked Sarah. She frowned. "I don't know. It felt like a few minutes ago." "It wasn't," I said, holding up my watch. "You were gone for over an hour." Her face went pale. "That's not possible," she whispered. Chris stood up, pacing the edge of the clearing. "We need to leave. This place isn't right." "We can't go anywhere until it's light," Jake said. "You want to hike out of here in the dark? With whatever's out there?" Chris didn't respond, but his expression made it clear he wasn't happy about staying. At first light, we packed up camp. None of us wanted to stay another night in the forest. Sarah was quiet as we worked, her usual energy replaced by something distant and heavy. Chris kept glancing back toward the circle, his shoulders tense. When we started hiking, the forest felt different. The trail we'd taken in seemed narrower, the trees closer together. The air was thick, and the metallic smell was stronger now, clinging to the back of my throat. After about an hour of hiking, we reached a clearing. It was small, the kind of place you'd barely notice unless you were looking for it. But right in the center stood a tree. It was unlike any tree I'd ever seen. The bark was blackened and twisted, its branches curling like claws toward the sky. Deep gouges marred its surface, and at its base, the ground was bare, as if nothing dared to grow near it. "Let's keep moving," Jake said quickly, his voice tight. But Chris stepped closer. "What are you doing?" I asked him. "There's something carved into it," he said, pointing to the trunk. We all gathered around the tree, staring at the markings. They were similar to the symbols in the circles Sarah had found, jagged, angular shapes etched deep into the wood. "What do they mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. None of us had an answer. Then we noticed the nails. Long, rusted nails had been driven into the trunk of the tree at random angles, some bent, others buried so deep they were barely visible. "It's like someone did this on purpose," Chris said, his voice low. Jake nodded. "Let's keep moving. Now." As we turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. I couldn't see its face, but its posture was unnerving, too still, too deliberate. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Jake. He turned quickly, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. We kept hiking, but the forest only seemed to grow darker, even as the sun climbed higher. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the trees, just shadows, flickering at the edge of my vision. And then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, we found it. Another circle. This one was larger, more intricate, with symbols that seemed to spiral inward. And in the very center of the circle was something new. A doll. It was old and weathered, its porcelain face cracked and smeared with dirt. Its eyes were wide, staring blankly upward, and its dress was torn and frayed. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered. Jake grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." As we turned to leave, the wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that froze me in my tracks. A whisper. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't distant. It was coming from the doll. The whisper from the doll wasn't loud, it was soft, almost fragile, but it carried an undeniable weight. We all froze, staring at the cracked porcelain face. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Jake said, gripping the knife tighter. "What did it say?" Chris asked. None of us answered. I wasn't even sure it had formed words, but it felt like it spoke to me, directly to me. Jake crouched down, examining the doll without touching it. "This is a warning," he muttered. "We're not supposed to be here." "No kidding," Chris snapped. "So let's leave." We backed away from the circle, careful not to disturb it, and started down the trail again. The forest seemed even darker now, the air heavier, almost suffocating. The metallic smell was back, stronger than ever, and with it came a new sound. Footsteps. They weren't loud, just faint crunches on the forest floor, following us at a steady pace. "Someone's behind us," Sarah whispered. I glanced back, but the trail was empty. "It's just your imagination," Chris said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No, it's not," Jake said, stopping abruptly. "Listen." We all fell silent. The footsteps stopped, too. For a moment, the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. Then, slowly, the footsteps started again. They were closer now. "Run," Jake said, his voice low but urgent. We didn't argue. We bolted down the trail, our backpacks bouncing against our shoulders, the sound of our breathing drowning out everything else. But no matter how fast we ran, the footsteps stayed with us. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, the trail had disappeared. "What the hell?" Chris said, looking around. The path we'd been following was gone, replaced by dense undergrowth and towering trees. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "We didn't leave the trail." Jake pulled out his phone, trying to open the GPS, "No signal," he muttered. Sarah was clutching her knees, her face pale. "We're lost, aren't we?" "No," Jake said firmly. "We'll figure it out. We just need to stay calm." But as we stood there, catching our breath, I noticed something strange. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant sound of the creek. It was as if the world had been muted. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Chris frowned. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly," I said. "It's too quiet." Jake tightened his grip on the knife. "We need to keep moving." We pushed forward, carving a path through the undergrowth. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches clawing at our clothes and backpacks. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into another clearing. And that's when we saw it. The tree. It was the same blackened, twisted tree we'd passed earlier, its bark covered in strange carvings. "That's impossible," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We've been walking in the opposite direction." "Maybe it's a different tree," Chris offered, though he didn't sound convinced. "It's not," Jake said. "Look." He pointed to one of the symbols carved into the bark. It was fresh, the edges of the cuts still raw. "This is the same tree." Before anyone could respond, a new sound cut through the silence. It wasn't a scream this time. It was laughter. It started softly, like it was coming from far away, but it grew louder and more distorted as it echoed through the trees. Chris spun around, holding up a branch he'd lit from the fire earlier. "Who's there?" he shouted. The laughter stopped abruptly. And then, from somewhere behind us, we heard the whisper again. "Leave," it said, clear as day. We all froze, our eyes darting around the clearing. "Who said that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Jake stepped forward, his flashlight sweeping the trees. "Show yourself." For a long moment, there was nothing. And then, slowly, something stepped out from the shadows. It wasn't human. It looked human at first, tall, thin, wearing what might have once been clothes. But its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. Its head tilted to the side, the way a predator studies prey. "What the hell is that?" Chris whispered. No one answered. The figure didn't move closer. It just stood there, watching us. And then it raised a hand, pointing directly at Sarah. She stumbled back, her breathing ragged. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Jake stepped in front of her, holding the knife out defensively. "Stay away." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it lowered its hand and took a single step forward. "Run!" Jake shouted. We bolted, sprinting back into the forest, the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves following close behind us. My chest burned as I ran, the weight of my backpack dragging me down. I glanced over my shoulder and saw it, still there, still moving, its jerky limbs cutting through the trees like they weren't even there. "We're not going to outrun it," I shouted. "Just keep moving," Jake yelled. We burst into another clearing, skidding to a stop. In the center of the clearing was another circle, larger than the ones before. And in the middle of the circle was the doll. But this time, it wasn't alone. The figure stepped into the clearing, stopping just outside the circle. For the first time, it seemed hesitant, its head tilting as it stared at the symbols carved into the ground. "It won't come closer," Sarah whispered. "Why not?" Chris asked. Jake didn't answer. He grabbed the doll and tossed it out of the circle. The figure froze, its head snapping toward Jake with inhuman speed. "What are you doing?" I hissed. Jake didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed a stick from the ground and began scratching through the symbols in the dirt. The moment the circle was broken, the figure let out a horrible, guttural scream and charged. The last thing I saw was the figure leaping into the clearing, its jagged limbs outstretched. And then everything went black. I woke up on the forest floor, my head pounding, my vision blurry. The world felt tilted, the trees stretching unnaturally tall above me, their twisted branches clawing at the pale gray sky. "Jake?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. "Sarah?" "Chris?" A groan answered from somewhere nearby. Jake stumbled into view, clutching his side. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat. "You're awake," he said, his voice tight with pain. "Thank God." "What happened?" I asked, sitting up slowly. Jake shook his head. "I don't know. The thing, it came at us, and then, everything just went dark." I looked around. Sarah was sitting a few feet away, her knees pulled to her chest, staring blankly at the ground. Chris was further off, pacing in circles, muttering under his breath. "Where are we?" I asked. Jake gestured vaguely. "Still in the forest. But, something's wrong. The sun hasn't moved." I frowned, glancing up at the sky. He was right. The light was dim, like early morning, but it hadn't changed since I woke up. Chris stopped pacing, turning to face us. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice sharp. "We can't stay here." Jake nodded reluctantly. "He's right. That thing could still be out there." Sarah didn't move. "Sarah," I said gently, crouching beside her. We have to go. She looked up at me, her eyes glassy. It won't let us leave, she whispered. What do you mean? She shook her head, her hands trembling. I saw it. In the dark. It's everywhere. Watching. Waiting. Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. We're not going to die here, he said firmly. Let's go. We started walking, staying close together, our footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. The forest felt endless, the trees closing in around us. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. After what felt like hours, we reached another clearing. And there it was again. The tree. No, Sarah whispered, backing away. No, no, no. It's not the same tree, Chris said, though his voice was trembling. It can't be. It is, I said, pointing to the carvings on the bark. Look. The fresh marks we'd seen earlier were still there, the jagged lines cutting deep into the wood. What do we do? Jake asked, his voice unsteady. Chris grabbed a rock from the ground. We end this. Before anyone could stop him, he ran to the tree and slammed the rock against the bark, splintering the carvings. The forest seemed to hold its breath. And then, the ground beneath us began to shake. The air filled with a deafening roar, a sound so low and guttural it felt like it was coming from the earth itself. Branches snapped, leaves swirled in the wind, and the metallic smell grew stronger, choking us. Chris stumbled back, dropping the rock. What's happening? The tree, Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. It's alive. The bark of the tree began to crack, deep splits running along its surface. A black, tar-like substance oozed from the wounds, pooling at its base. And then, from the shadows, the figure emerged. It was faster this time, its jagged limbs moving with inhuman precision. It didn't hesitate, didn't stop to watch. It came straight for us. Run! Jake shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. We sprinted back into the forest, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps close behind. The trees seemed to move, their trunks twisting and bending, blocking our path. The light grew dimmer, the air colder, as if the forest itself was trying to trap us. This way! Jake shouted, leading us toward a faint glow in the distance. It was the creek. We burst out of the trees, stumbling onto the rocky bank. The water shimmered in the faint light, its current strong and fast. Across the water, Jake said. It won't follow us. How do you know that? Chris demanded. I don't, Jake admitted. But it's our best shot. We plunged into the creek, the icy water shocking my system. The current was stronger than I expected, pulling at my legs as I struggled to stay upright. Behind us, the figure reached the edge of the water. It stopped. For a moment, it just stood there, watching us. Then it stepped into the creek. No! Sarah screamed, her voice raw with fear. The water hissed and bubbled where the figure stepped, the black tar from its body dissolving into the current. It didn't stop. We scrambled up the opposite bank, dripping and shivering, as the figure reached the center of the creek. Its movement slowed, its body trembling. The black tar poured from its limbs in thick streams, staining the water. And then, with a final, guttural scream, it collapsed. The forest fell silent. We sat on the bank, gasping for breath, watching as the current carried away the remnants of the figure. Is it over? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded slowly. I think so. Chris didn't say anything. He just stared at the water, his hands shaking. We found our way out of the forest a few hours later, emerging onto a quiet road. A passing car stopped to help us, the driver staring at us like we were ghosts. You kids okay? He asked. None of us answered. We never talked about what happened in Black Hollow Forest. Jake moved to another state. Chris stopped camping altogether. And Sarah. Sarah still wakes up in the middle of the night, screaming about whispers and shadows. As for me, I haven't been back to the forest since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it. A faint rustling. A whisper. And I know it's still out there. Waiting. Have you ever been somewhere that felt wrong? What did you do?